Hello and welcome to the Quickstarter guide. Here you will get an overview over the complete material, which will enable you to already start playing the Sicilian Four Knights. And I personally believe it's a very convenient way to start learning a new opening. You don't need to invest a lot of time, and you can already start playing it, be it in blitz games, maybe training games, but also your serious tournament games, because by getting your own experiences, it's much easier to learn the new material. So here you find first the most important variations from a theoretical point of view, by which I mean the ones played in on high level, let's say Grandmaster practice, the ones recommended for white in opening courses and books. But also we will look at variations which are less challenging, maybe at times even leading to worse positions for white, but which are quite logical and played a lot by players who are not familiar with theory. And thirdly, there are included a few variations which feature important tactical motives, which are also quite important to know. And here, very often I do not go very deep and just give you the moves which are essential to know. So whenever you feel you want to know more about a specific position, you can always go to the chapters and deepen your knowledge. In the text, you can also find the links to specific variations. So let's start. After e4, we play c5, the Sicilian, knight f3, e6. So here we will only consider the open Sicilian when white plays d4. We take on d4, and after knight takes d4, we start attacking white's center by playing knight f6. So we are already attacking the pawn on e4. Here it's important to know that white cannot play e5, because now we have queen a5 check, and next we can take on e5, winning a pawn. And white's most frequent move here is knight c3, protecting the pawn. Here we continue attacking white's center. We play knight c6, and now we have reached the starting position of the four knights Sicilian. And here white has a number of options, and if you look at the chapter structure in the course, you will see that most chapters start here with white's sixth move. There are two main moves, and we will start by looking at the main variations. The two main moves are knight db5 and knight takes c6. In general, what is this position about? We want to put pressure against white's center, and you will see it in the sidelines, where we often play bishop b4 and attack white's pawn on e4. So very often you want to play a quick d5 and put a lot of pressure against white's pawn on e4. Here we start by looking at knight db5, and this is the move which is most popular in tournament practice. Here white tries to use the fact that we move both our e and c pawn. So now there is a weakness on d6, as well as a weakness on c7. So white's immediate threat here is to play knight d6 check, but white might also play bishop f4, attacking our dark squares. And here my recommendation is the move bishop c5, which is a very interesting move. It's considered a sideline, but it's getting more and more popular, and it leads to very unusual and interesting positions. Just to give you some idea what alternatives are there for black, the move most popular here for black is d6, when the game usually transposes to the Sveshnikov Sicilian, which is one of the Sicilian main variations, bishop f4, e5, and bishop g5. Also a very interesting opening, but heavily analyzed. You will need to know a lot if you want to play it as black. And there is another move which is also more popular than bishop c5, bishop b4, which is very playable, but it leads to a somewhat dull position, if you ask me. Black is fighting for equality, and black is a bit worse from a positional point here, but it also has been analyzed quite deeply, and it's a good way to play for draw. Instead, the move I find more interesting is bishop c5, when play is a bit less forcing, and the bishop is quite well placed on c5. We put pressure against the pawn on f2. And here, white has two main moves, and we start by looking at the most popular one, which is bishop f4. The other main move is knight d6 check, and we'll also look at it, of course. But now let's consider bishop f4. White, of course, is threatening to win our rook by going knight c7 check. And in general, the bishop is very well placed on f4, also controlling the weakened d6 square and also the e5 square. So at some point, white might play e4, e5. And here, there is only one good move for black, which is to castle. Instead, e5 doesn't work so well here because it weakens the squares on f5 and d5, and after bishop e3, bishop takes e3, knight d6 check, black is already in trouble. And there will be an attack against the f7 pawn. So we should castle here, bring the king to safety, and now knight c7 no longer poses a threat. Knight c7 here would be answered by e5. And if white takes on a8, we simply take the bishop, and the knight on a8 will not escape. So black ends up with an advantage here. We'll start by looking at white's best move, the main variation, which is bishop c7. White drives our queen to a worse square. We have to go to e7 here. And now after queen e7, white plays bishop d6 and forces the exchange of bishops. Bishop takes d6, queen takes d6. So now we can see what white is playing for. There is a blockade on the d6 square, which makes it quite hard for us to develop our queen side. We would very much like to play d5 here, but of course it's not possible if white's queen stays on d6. Here we want to avoid trading the queens, and we go queen d8. Because later we can drive away white's queen. Very often we can play knight e8, and if possible we might go d5 at some point. Also, we might start driving back white's knight on b5 by playing a6. Here, white's main move is castling queenside. And another quite serious move is knight c7. But before looking at those two theoretical main variations, we will start by looking at a few sidelines. One move which is played quite a lot is queen c7. So here white insists on trading queens. But it's not a challenging move because now we can play d5. And in general, if we are able to play d5, winning some space in the center and also preparing to develop our queenside, usually black is doing very well. And here already we are threatening to attack white's knights by playing d4 and a6. And here white usually takes on d5, and after e takes d5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8. I wanted to show you here a very important tactical motive, which can occur in different variations in different circumstances. Here, castling queenside looks like a very natural way for white to continue. White's rook is well placed on d1. It puts pressure against our isolated pawn on d5. But here it does not work for white because we got d4, attacking white's knight. And it doesn't matter where it goes. Let's say it goes to e2. Our next move is knight e4. And white is unable to protect the f2 pawn. And it does not help to play f3 here because we go knight f2 anyway, winning the exchange. So here black is already better. And instead of knight ce2, it doesn't matter if white goes knight b1. We also have knight e4. And once again, there is no way for white to protect the f2 pawn. So next we look at knight c7. As I mentioned, it's white's second most popular move, and it's quite a serious attempt to play for an opening advantage. Compared to the main line, which is castling queenside, here white takes a somewhat slower approach and plays for a positional advantage. So the idea of knight c7 is to protect the e8 square and prevent us from driving away white's queen by playing knight e8. Of course, now our rook is attacked on a8, so here we should play rook b8. And now white's main move is bishop e2. So white is preparing to castle kingside, but what is even more important is that white is controlling the g4 square and now wants to play e5 when our knight would have to retreat to e8. And here it's quite important to play dynamically and play b5 here. So the point is we want to win some space on the queen side. There is the idea to attack white's knight on c3 by playing b4. Sometimes we might play rook b6, when we might later attack white's queen by moving our knight. And also, of course, we are preparing to simply continue development by playing bishop b7. And of course, white might take on b5, but we will win back our pawn quite quickly here because it would open up the b file and there is no good way for white to win a pawn here. So if you want to understand more about the details of white takes on b5, you should consult the chapter. But here we will look at white's main continuation, which is not taking the pawn, but instead playing e5. So that was the reason why white played bishop e2 one move earlier. Now we cannot go knight g4. So just quickly to compare it, if white here had played e5 immediately after knight g4, black is already much better. Because the only way for white to protect the e5 pawn would be f4, but now after knight e3, black wins material. There is a threat of knight takes c2 check as well as knight f5, when white can no longer protect the knight on c7. So therefore white plays bishop e2 first, b5 and now e5. And now we have to retreat to e8. And now white can take on e8. So that was the idea why white played knight c7. After knight takes e8, rook takes e8, white managed to keep the queen on d6. Now the main move is castling kingside. And now finally white is already threatening to win a pawn by taking on b5. So here we should play b4, knight e4, and now finish our development by going bishop b7. And it's quite an interesting position. On the first sight, it might look like white is better here, because white has control over the dark squares, d6 and c5. And our pieces are not very active yet, but we have a clear plan, which is to bring our knight to e7, after which our bishop on b7 is very active. And our knight might go to f5, that's where it usually wants to go, attacking white's queen. But there's also the idea to play knight d5, when white should be careful not to lose the queen on d6, which might get trapped. So we will look at this position much deeper in chapter 1. But for here, I believe it is enough if you know the idea of playing knight e7. And sometimes we will need to prepare it because the b4 pawn might be hanging. So for instance, if white goes bishop d3, here knight e7 immediately does not work. We need to first protect the pawn on b4. And generally speaking, there are two possible ways to do so. So one is playing a5, and the other is bishop a8. So in both cases, we are protecting the b4 pawn, and next we can go knight e7. Sometimes white, sometimes you don't need to prepare knight e7. So for instance, after rook d1, we might go knight e7 immediately. The point being, if white takes on b4, white's queen is overloaded, having to protect both the knight on e4 as well as the pawn on b2. So here black gets good counterplay, and once again, if you want to know a bit more about this position, you can consult chapter 1. Here, instead of knight c7, white's main move is castling queenside. And it leads to a very sharp and interesting position. Here we have a situation quite typical for open Sicilians. White has castled queenside and black has castled kingside. So here both sides will play for an attack. And for us, it's very clear we want to go a6 and b5. And white as well will usually at some point start pushing their pawns on the king side. So here we go a6. Now white's knight has to retreat. knight c7 would be a typical blunder because the knight on c7 now is trapped, and we can go rook a7 and next move our b pawn, and white is unable to protect the knight on c7. So instead white should go knight d4, and here is a very important moment. Here the best move for black is knight e7, which is a move quite hard to find, and indeed it has only been played in 2017 the first time. Before, black's main move here was queen b6, and you can find a few variations, a bit of analysis on queen b6, but it leads to a position which is a bit better for white because black has not a lot of counterplay, and white has a very nice blockade of the d pawn. Here white takes on c6, and after b takes c6, for instance f3, white's position is very solid. The open b file is not very dangerous for white's king, and in general white has more control of the position. So therefore the whole variation with bishop c5 was for a long time considered a bit dubious, leading to some small advantage for white. But after knight e7 has been discovered, things are not so simple for white anymore. So here the knight on e7 is not particularly well placed, but the idea is simply to avoid trading knights. And later we can start our play on the queen side by pushing our b pawn. Also we might at any moment drive away white's queen from d6 by playing knight e8. And here there have been tried a lot of different moves from white, and we will look at only the two most popular ones here. First, a move often played is f3. Quite a typical move for a lot of Sicilians as well. So white, first of all, protects the pawn on e4, but mainly white's intention is to prepare pushing the g pawn. So white is playing for an attack on the king side. But f3 here is a bit slow, and black gets quite good play. First we want to go b5. Not yet threatening to play b4, but as you will see, we will soon prepare to play b4. So now white's most logical continuation would be g4, after which we go knight e8. And it's a typical situation here. White's queen is attacked and has to decide whether to go to the king side or to the queen side. If white chooses the queen side, the queen does prevent us from immediately pushing our pawns, but also is a bit vulnerable itself, and we will protect our b pawn. So here we might play rook b8 or knight c7, and after our b pawn is protected, we can start pushing away white's queen and continue attacking on the queen side. So also besides rook b8 and knight c7, there is another quite typical way to prepare pushing b4, which is d6 followed by e5 and knight c6. Instead, white might go to the king side, so queen g3, but now the b4 square is no longer protected, and we can simply continue pushing the pawns. Knight b1, for instance, and now d6. In general, our bishop goes to b7. in most of the variations when white has castle kingside, queenside. But if white has already played f3, it's not very well placed on b7 anymore, because white's pawn on e4 is very safely defended, and there it's usually a better idea to try and bring the bishop to e6. So here we want to go g6. Later we might play e5, put our bishop to e6. And here it turns out that black's attack is a bit faster. We have we have an easier goal. We can already have the open half open c file, so we can bring our rook to c8. And of course, we can also include our a pawn in the attack. And for white, it's not so easy to open a file on the king side and create a quick attack there. Instead of f3, a more challenging way for white to play is the move h4, which slowly might become the main line. It's played in it's the most popular move for white, and also a very dangerous one. White's idea is very simple: to continue pushing the h pawn. So first we play our usual b5 here, but now after h5 already we should take some time to prevent white's attack, because here allowing white's pawn on to come to h6 is very dangerous. So for instance, bishop b7, h6. Now white is already threatening to open the h file, so here we would have to play g6. And now our dark squares are very weak. There are always some ideas to play for mate on g7. We always have to be careful about it. And in general, I believe it's a very dangerous position for black. So here I believe whenever a white pawn appears on h5, we should stop it by playing h6 ourselves. Which also has its drawbacks. Having played h6 gives white the pawn break g4, g5, which is very dangerous. And here white can already play g4, because taking the pawn on g4 is too dangerous. It would open the g file and white gets a very strong attack here. So when white's attack is beginning to become dangerous and our attack is not very far advanced yet, we should try and trade queens. And we see how to do it here. First, we can go bishop b7, as now white first needs to protect the pawn on e4. So for instance, bishop d3. And now we would like to play a move like queen b8, which of course now is not possible yet, because the knight on e7 would not be protected. So here we go knight c6 first. Just to mention, if white had played f3 here, I believe knight c6 is not black's best way to start playing for the exchange of queens, but instead here we can go rook e8 with the idea to play queen b8 next, or maybe even rook c8 followed by queen c7. In general, the point is, if white if queens are traded, white's attack is no longer dangerous, and therefore it's a very good way to defend. So back to bishop d3. Here we play knight c6, and after knight takes c6, bishop takes c6. Now already we might consider taking on g4 if white allows it. So instead white should play rook g1, or at least it's the most logical move, because not only does the rook protect the pawn on g4, but also it threatens now to go g5. But now we have time to go queen b8 and force the exchange of queens. And it leads to a very complex and interesting endgame. I analyzed it a lot deeper in chapter 1. But in general, black is doing okay here. White can still put a little pressure, but if we now know how to react, black has good chances here. We will later return to bishop f4 and look at a few sidelines for white, but before doing so, we start looking at the other main move for white, which is knight d6 check here. Once again, a very logical move. White has played knight db5, knight db5 one move earlier in order to play knight d6 check, and here they can do so. And here it's important to go king e7. Taking on d6 would be very bad for black after queen takes d6. White's queen is very well placed on d6. We cannot castle, and also our dark squares are very weak here. And also also king f8 is not a good idea because white's knight on d6 is very unpleasant for us, and we cannot easily develop our queen side. And also our rook on h8 is not taking an active role here. So it's very important to drive away white's knight from d6, and we can do so by attacking it with the king e7. And here white faces a choice. A move which is quite popular and even played by a lot of strong players is knight takes c8. And it does look logical. White has achieved to prevent us from castling by going knight d6 check, and now takes our bishop, so white gets the bishop pair. But it turns out it's already the initiative is on black's side here, and white is the side who has to play precisely to get an equal game here. So rook takes c8, and now white usually prepares to castle kingside, so let's say bishop d3. After bishop e2 it's very similar. Here we go queen c7, and we will see the idea in a moment. White usually plays castles here, and now we suddenly play for an attack by going h5. And it turns out it's quite a strong attack. The immediate idea is to go knight g4, attacking the h2 pawn and threatening mate. But also our bishop on c5 is very well placed. Our queen also has an eye on white's king side. So a lot of attacking potential for black here, whereas all white's minor pieces are on the queen side and cannot really help to defend. So here already black has a very strong initiative. White has to be very careful here. And of course, this position will also be analyzed much deeper, and you can find it in chapter 2. Therefore here, instead of taking on c8, it's better for white to protect the knight by playing bishop f4. And once again, we cannot really tolerate white's knight on d6, so here we have no choice. we have to go e5, which is a move we generally do not want to play because it weakens the f5 and d5 squares, but here we have to in order to free our position. And once again, White's knight is attacked on d6, and taking on c8 here is once again not very challenging. Therefore, White's best move is knight f5 check, king f8, and here once again White faces a choice. Bishop e3 is quite popular. White is attacking our bishop, and the idea is if we trade bishops, White goes queen d6 check and already has a very serious attack. We cannot play like this, as our king will not get to safety here. But instead we have a much stronger move, which is bishop b4, and from b4 we are attacking the knight on c3, so maybe there's the pawn on e4 might be hanging, but even more importantly, we fight for the control over the d5 square. So here we want to go d5, and from White's point of view, it's very hard to prevent us from doing so. Even if White goes bishop c4 here, we can go d5 because not only do we attack White's bishop and the pawn on e4, but also the knight on f5. So you can find the details in chapter 2. But here we will only look at White's most popular move, which is a3, forcing the issues. So here we have to take on c3, but after b takes c3, once again, we can play d5, and thus we can free our queenside. Our bishop on c8 is now taking part, and it's also already attacking White's knight on f5. So here, for instance, after e takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop c5 check, king g8, bishop c4, bishop takes f5, bishop takes d5, queen f6. Black has no problems. White does have the bishop pair and is quite active, but on the other hand, White's pawns are weak, and we can continue by playing rook d8. Our rook on h8 will also get active. We can, for instance, play h5 and bring it over to g6. Or another way to activate our rook is going h6, king h7, and then, for instance, rook e8. Therefore, bishop e3, even though it looks quite logical, but in fact it's not the best move for White. A stronger try is bishop g5. The reason being that on g5, White's bishop pins our knight, and here the fight revolves around the d5 square. It's the most important square here, and therefore the bishop is much better placed on g5 than on e3. And here bishop b4 for black exists as well, but it does not really work. So here we have to take a somewhat slower approach and simply continue to develop our pieces. Here we go d6, freeing our bishop on c8, and the bishop usually goes to e6, but we might also take on f5 if White allows us to do so. Now the position is a bit slower, and here white has tried a lot of different moves, and of course once again we will look at a few of them quite deeply. But what is very important to know for you is first of all one tactical motive here. So for instance, after knight e3, bishop e6, white would very much like to play knight d5, knight cd5 for instance, but it does not work yet. White needs to prepare it. Here we simply go queen a5 check, and now the e4 pawn is hanging. So after c3 we can take on e4, and black has simply won a very important pawn. Here also attacking the bishop on g5, so trying b4 here does not help for white. So knight d5 usually does not work so early. So also one move earlier, for instance, knight d5 does not work because once again we have queen a5 check. So instead we can look at a normal developing move like bishop d3, preparing to castle kingside. And here what you need to know is our general setup, which we can employ against various white various ways for white to play. So we want to go h6, force white to take on f6. After queen takes f6, next we bring our king to g7 by playing g6, and our king on g7 is very safe, and also our rook on h8 can finally take part in the game. So for instance, white can play knight d5 now. Here we simply retreat to d8. c3 is a logical move for white, taking control over d4 and as well as preparing to play b4. But we simply continue by going for our setup and playing king g7 here. In practice, black very often after c3 in this or similar positions plays a move like a6 or a5 with the idea to meet, or the idea to prevent b4 or give the bishop a retreat square on a7. But I don't believe it's really necessary here to spend a tempo on it, because if white goes b4, we want to take on e3, because here as well the fight is very much revolving around the d5 square. So taking on e3 is not a bad idea in general for black, even though it gives up our bishop pair. It does take away one defender of the d5 square. And this position is roughly equal, but still a bit dangerous for black, because there are some ideas for white, like opening the f-file by going f4, and also b4 at some moment can challenge us. So here we should be a bit careful, and in general it's a good idea to play for trading pieces and and fighting for the d5 square. So for instance, we might go knight e7 at some point, we might take on e3. Another typical move, which is very often improving black's position, is going rook f8. Just in case of white plays f4, our rook is already helping in the defense. Let us now come back to the position after knight db5, bishop c5, and look at a few sidelines for white. Um, one sideline worth knowing is bishop e3. The idea is to exchange our dark squared bishop in order to get even more control over the dark squares. But it's not a very good move because it leads to the weakening of white's pawn structure. We take on e3. Now white's idea was knight d6 check, king e7, f takes e3. And here we should immediately attack the knight on d6 by going queen c7. And in the long run, black has the better position here because the e4 and e3 pawns are weak, as well as the square e5, which also cannot be protected by a white pawn anymore. And white does not succeed in keeping a blockading piece on d6. So we might later play knight e8 once again, but already here it's very hard for white to keep the knight on d6. So for instance, after knight cb5, we can go queen b6, and it's very hard to protect the e3 pawn. And if white takes the other knight, we have queen e5, and already we have very nice control over the d6 square. So therefore bishop e3 is not a very good move for white. And we will return to white's main move, bishop f4, castles, and here let me remind you, white's best way of playing is bishop c7, but instead we will look at two alternatives. One is e5, which is an attempt to play for an attack on the king side. So white wants to drive away our knight from f6, and later might play knight e4 and bishop d3, so bring a lot of minor pieces towards our king side. Here it's important to remember the intermediate move a6. If white takes on f6 now, we take on f6 back, and here black is better because white cannot keep the extra piece, and black has a lot of control in the center and also is better developed. So white should go knight d6 instead, and now we play knight e8. And now if white plays knight ce4, which is a very logical continuation, bringing the knight towards our king side, here we see why it was important to play a6 first, because here we have the move bishop d4, attacking the e5 and b2 pawns. And of course it was not possible earlier, so let's go back. After e5, if we had played knight e8 here, after knight e4, white controls the d4 square, so we cannot go bishop d4 here, and therefore it's a worse version for black. So here, after bishop d4, already white has to play precisely in order to keep the balance. And of course, once again, you can find the details in the corresponding chapter, which is chapter 3. Next, instead of e5, we will look at a move which is played quite a lot, looks very logical, but is also not precise because it's a move bishop d6, and we have seen the idea already in the main line, which was once again to remind you, bishop c7 first, and only after queen e7 bishop d6. But if white goes bishop d6 immediately, it's a worse version for white, because we get a more active position. Here we have a very nice tactical idea. We can go queen b6, protecting our bishop and also threatening mate in 2. So here black cannot take on, white cannot take on f8 because if the bishop takes f2 check, no matter where the king goes, we play queen e3 mate. And if white trades the bishops now, we get a better version compared to the main line. Here already we are threatening to play d5, after which we would get very active and also start pushing back white's knights. So white usually plays queen d6 now to prevent us from moving the d pawn and hoping for a better endgame, but here once again we do not trade queens and play queen b6 instead. And now compared to the main line where our queen was on d8 instead of b6, here it's much better placed. So we can just look at the 2 moves which were critical in the main variation. First of all, castling queenside here does not really work for white because now we can take on f2, winning a pawn. And also knight c7 is pointless now, and also we can win material here by taking on b2. So there's also already a threat of playing a6, followed by taking on b2 if white's knight moves away. Therefore here white usually plays queen c7, and it gives us a quite pleasant choice. We can play queen c5, after which once again black is threatening to play d5 and taking over. So here white should play queen d6 again, and we can already repeat the position by going queen b6 and make a draw. But we don't have to agree to a draw yet, just yet. We can also, after queen c7, take on c7. Take on c7, knight takes d7, rook b8, which leads to an endgame, or maybe not yet an endgame, but a queenless middle game where black is not worse. And white has to be a bit careful because the knight on c7 might get trapped. So one idea here is to play a6, cutting its retreat route to b5. And it's not very easy to attack it here. It does take some time, but eventually black might win the knight on c7. So for instance, black might play b5, bishop b7, rook c8. And yeah, white needs to do something about the knight on c7. So yeah, it's a good way to play on. Objectively, white is still doing fine here, but from a practical point of view, I believe it's quite difficult for white to play. Now it's time to consider white's second main line, knight takes c6, which is similar to knight db5 in the sense that here as well white plays very directly and white tries to exploit our weakened dark squares. Here it's best to take back with the b pawn, and now we try to build a very solid center, and if white allows us, we would go d5 next, after which black gets very easy play. We will see a bit of it later. But white does not have to allow it, and the main move here for white is e5, continuing to play very directly. Of course, now our knight on f6 is attacked. And it has to leave the king side, which means white might later start an attack there. But besides, white tries to gain more space and take control over the dark squares. So here after knight d5, white's strongest continuation is knight e4. And you can see white controls the d6 square and also takes some control over the c5 square. The pawn on e5 makes it very hard for us to play the liberating move, d7, d6 or d7, d5. And white also already is threatening here to play c4, followed by knight d6 check. So all of this is quite nice for white, but it also has a drawback. White lost a bit of time and also extended a bit far by playing e5, and we can take advantage of this by attacking white's pawn on e5. And there's only one sensible defending move for white, which is f4. And f4 is the move white generally tries to avoid because it weakens the king's position. And we can exploit it by going queen b6. And now you can see white's king will probably not be able to castle kingside anymore because our queen on b6 already takes control over the g1 square. Also, the e3 square has been weakened by white playing f4. So here there's an idea of going knight e3. And in general, our queen is very well placed on b6. There's a direct threat of queen b4 check, attacking white's knight on e4. And also we are keeping some pressure against the b2 pawn, making it quite hard for white to develop. So here white's main move is again a very direct one. White plays c4, attacking our knight on d5. Now the move I like best for black is knight e3. So here already we are taking advantage of the weakened e3 square. And instead I'd like to mention the main line for black here is bishop b4 check, because white has only one way to answer, which is king e2. And of course it's quite dangerous for white to have the king centralized on e2. It usually later goes to f3, but there as well it is not completely safe. And here we get a very interesting, crazy position, which however is already quite far analyzed, and therefore I decided not to recommend it. We would need to invest a lot of time, and white usually is quite well prepared if they go for this main line. Therefore I believe a good practical alternative is knight e3, which, as we will see, also leads to good play for black. But it's less well known for white, and also I believe it's a bit less complicated, even though still there is quite a bit of theory, and we will look at the most important lines now. Here there's only one good reaction for white, which is queen d3. White has, of course, to keep the c2 square protected. Now our knight on e3 is attacked, but we don't have to move it, and also the intention of playing knight e3 was not to exchange the knight against white's bishop on f1. Instead we try to keep the knight on e3 as long as possible. And here we continue by playing bishop b4 check. And now bishop d2 is white's best move, but before looking at it we will study an alternative king e2, which is quite popular in the Lichess database of games played online. It shows that this whole idea of knight e3 followed by bishop b4 check is not so well known, because here king e2 is a tactical mistake. Still, it does lead to quite some forcing lines. So here it's also quite important to know how to react. But king e2 first of all allows us to win a pawn by taking on c4. So we take advantage of the fact that queen and king are placed on the same diagonal, and now queen takes c4, of course, loses the queen after bishop a6. And in general, we now threaten to go bishop a6, taking once again advantage of the placement of king and queen. So here white should play king f3. Now our knight on c4 is attacked, and we have to protect it by going bishop a6, threatening now to win white's queen by taking on e5 and on d3 next. White goes queen c2, and here play is quite sharp. Our pieces are not very well placed, they are not quite safe. Now, of course, our knight on c4 is attacked, and retreating it is not a good option because the only square available is a5, and our pieces would be very badly placed. So here, instead, we play queen d4, protecting the knight, and also creating some attacking chances, because white's king on f3, of course, is not very safe. And here, white's best idea is to play bishop e2 followed by rook d1, but it's important to first chase away our bishop from b4 and play a3 here. After bishop e2 instead, we would go f5, attacking white's knight on e4, and after e takes f6, d5, once again attacking the knight. It's a very common idea in this whole exchange variation, so you should remember it. White's e5 pawn prevents both our f and d pawn to go forward, but white cannot prevent those two pawns going forward at the same time. So it's a very common idea to play either f5 followed by d5, or the other way around by starting with d5 and then going f5. Here f5 is the right movement after e takes f6, d5. We are threatening to take here with check, and black is already much better. Of course, we will study it in more detail in the chapter on the exchange variation. Here I just wanted to show you the best way to continue for white, which is to play a3 first. Now after bishop e7, bishop e2. And here we see our pieces are not very stable. There's the idea of playing rook d1, after which we would lose our knight on c4. And here the idea I mentioned earlier, f5 no longer works for black, because after e takes f6, our bishop on e7 is hanging, so we don't have time to go d5 here. Here instead we play g5. And the idea is now to go g4 followed by knight e3. And here white should not trade on c4, and white will win back the pawn, but it leads to a position where still black is a bit better. Of course, we will study it more deeply in the theory chapter. Now we go back to bishop b4 check and look at bishop d2, which is white's best move. But now our knight on e3 is no longer attacked. It is the bishop on d2 is pinned, so we don't have to waste time moving our knight and instead play bishop a6, attacking white's pawn on c4. Here white has 3 sensible continuations, and we will look at all of them here in the Quickstarter as well, because of all of them are quite common. So first of all, white can protect the pawn on c4 by playing either rook c1 or b3, and the third option for white is to trade on b4. If white goes rook c1, we now should force the issue and take on c4 here, because here white is already threatening to take on b4 and play queen c3 next. So for instance, after castles, bishop takes b4, queen takes b4 check, white goes queen c3, and here we end up with a very bad bishop on a6 against a very strong knight on e4, and here black would be much worse. Therefore here we should take on c4, and now after rook takes c4, knight takes c4, queen takes c4, we take on d2, and next we will take on b2. So here white can take back on d2 with the king or the knight. Both moves are possible and equally strong, and we get a quite interesting position where black has rook and 2 pawns against 2 minor pieces. Objectively, it's a balanced position. We will use the b file to create our play. And once again, we will look at this position in much more detail. Here, white's most common defense is b3. But compared to rook c1, here white is not threatening yet to take on b4. So here we have time to castle. Now white usually does take on b4. But after queen takes b4 check, white cannot play queen c3 here, because after knight c2 check, followed by queen takes c3 and knight takes a1, we win material. Therefore here white plays king f2. And now finally we have to move our knight. And here as well, it's not a good idea to exchange it against white's bishop, because white's bishop is still very passive and our knight can attack white's position. So here we retreat to d5, once again using a pin, and now we are attacking the pawn on f4. After g3, here it's important to remember to first give a check. Queen b6 check, because here we can bring our queen to a better square where it is protected. For instance, after f6, white has a very strong move, queen d2, forcing the exchange of queens because our knight on d5 now is hanging. And here queen b6 check already is not good anymore, because white can now play c5. So therefore here we should go queen b6 check. Now of course c5 is not possible, because we can take on d3. Here white plays king g2. It's also possible to go to f3, but king g2 looks like a more natural way of continuing. And here I propose a very interesting novelty, c5. Before there have been games where black played f6, which is also a very logical move and leads to fairly good play for black to an equal position. But I believe we can be even a bit more ambitious here. And c5 opens the long diagonal, so later we want to bring our bishop to b7 and create threats against white's king. And also there are some very interesting ideas, like regrouping our knight to d4, for instance via b4 and c6. And there it would be very well placed and prevent white from defending the long diagonal by going bishop e2 and f3. And also there are some ideas to open the position. There's the usual pawn break f7, f6, but also very often we can go d7, d5, opening the position after which white's king is in a lot of danger. So here I believe black has very good practical chances, even though objectively the position is still equal. Finally, white can take on b4 here, and it leads to very forcing play. Of course, we have to take back. And here white plays king f2. And now there's only one good move for black. We should take on b2. Because instead, knight takes c4 loses material after queen b3. Our knight on c4 is pinned. And yeah, white is winning a piece here. So we should take on b2. And now, of course, white's rook on a1 is attacked, so white cannot yet take on e3, but instead plays bishop e2. And now we win yet another pawn by taking on c4. But white didn't just blunder 2 pawns here, because our pieces are not well positioned, and white can win some material here. So here white has 2 possible continuations. One is attacking the d7 pawn by going rook hd1. After which black's best move is queen b6 check. And now if white moves the king, we would simply castle kingside and have the better position. But instead white can play queen d4, offering the exchange of queens and also attacking our knight on c4. And here it's best to immediately sacrifice some material in order to step out of the pin. And therefore we go knight b2. And after bishop takes a6, knight takes d1 check, rook takes d1. We once again get a position where we have rook and 2 pawns against 2 minor pieces. Of course, here we cannot win another piece, because after queen takes d7 check, king f8, and knight g5, black is mated. So instead we take on d4, rook takes d4, and now rook b8 is the best way for black to continue. And now we want to use the b file in order to create counterplay. Once again, quite an interesting position, which objectively is equal. And we will study it in a bit more detail in the chapter on the exchange variation. White's other move is rook ab1, attacking our queen. And it also leads to quite forcing play. Here we have only one good move, which is knight takes e5. Here we have to give back material. Here we have to sacrifice a piece, because taking on a2 is not an option. White might later play rook a1 and win one of our pieces. Knight takes e5. Now we are attacking White's queen. And after f takes e5, queen takes e5, queen takes a6, queen takes e4. We reach a position where we have 4 pawns against White's bishop. Now White's best move is rook hd1. White's rook is very well placed on d1. It puts pressure against our d7 pawn, and also White might later bring the king back to g1, for instance by playing bishop f3 and king g1 without trapping the own rook on h1. And this position would be very bad for us if not for the fact that we can castle here, because White cannot take on d7 yet, as the b1 rook would be lost. And we reach a position which is very unusual. At the moment we have 4 pawns, but we are very likely to lose one of those, because White has a lot of pressure against our queen side. And we should be careful not to lose the a7 pawn, at least if we do not get anything in return, because White's a pawn might be quite dangerous. So usually we try to play d5 at some point, giving up the c6 pawn. But our remaining pawns are very stable, and it's very hard for White to create any winning chances here. So I believe this endgame should end in a draw, objectively speaking, but still there is a lot of fight ahead, and there have been a few recent games where it was tried in practice. In general, Black did very well here. We will now go back to the position after b takes c6 and look at a few sidelines for White. So what happens if White does not play the forcing and ambitious main line, which we just analyzed. Here White might play bishop d3, and it's a move which is very popular among players who are not who do not know the theory and just play normal moves. White simply prepares to castle kingside. A very sensible, solid approach, but on the other hand, it does not put any pressure on our position, and we can now go d5, after which we get a very easy game. For instance, after castles, we now can play bishop e7 and continue to develop. Next we would castle kingside, and there's only one problem in our position, which is our bishop on c8. It's quite passive, But here we have a very effective idea. A5 followed by bishop A6. And we can exchange our bishop against white's bishop on D3. And A5 in general is a very useful move. We can also push the pawn later to A4 and maybe even A3 if allowed, and create some play against white's queenside. And another idea worth remembering here is the idea to improve our knight, which is not badly placed on F6, but it's also not doing a lot. And here we can go knight D7, followed by C5, putting pressure against white's bishop on D3, and also opening up the possibility to bring our bishop on F6, where it's also a bit more active. So here black gets very easy, comfortable equality. Just to mention the reason why I chose bishop E7 here, in a very similar position with white's knight on D2 instead of C3, my recommendation is bishop D6. But here it runs into some concrete issues after queen E2, threatening E5. And now after queen C7, white can take on D5, as c takes D5 is not a good idea because white goes knight B5 and exchanges our important dark squared bishop. And therefore here bishop E7 is a better choice. So we come back here after b takes c6, and now look at a few sidelines after e5, knight d5, and here sometimes white takes on d5, but this as well is not very challenging. After c takes d5, we have a nice pawn center. We do have a double pawn on the d file, but it's not a weakness, and we can at any moment simply play d6 and exchange it. And here play might continue bishop d3. And now there's one idea which is worth remembering, bishop a6, even though it's not the move I'm recommending here, but just so you have already seen it, bishop a6 is intended to exchange once again our bad bishop. And of course, if white takes on a6, the idea is to go queen a5 check and win back the piece. Here, after bishop d3, I believe it's not the best way to continue. Instead, I like the move queen c7, putting pressure against white's pawn on e5. And it turns out it's not so easy for white to defend it, because every defensive move has its own drawback. So for instance, if white goes f4, the a7 g1 diagonal is weakened, and it's quite hard for white to castle kingside. If white plays bishop f4, the b2 pawn is no longer protected, and we can put pressure here by playing rook b8. And finally, the move we are looking at here is queen e2, which has also its own drawbacks, because here we go bishop b4 check, and the move white would want to play c3, but it does not work. We can take it. B takes c3, queen takes c3, and take on a1 next. Also, bishop d2 is not a good move, because after bishop takes d2, white cannot take back with the queen, as the queen has to protect the e5 pawn, and after king takes d2, white's king would be very badly placed. So white has to go king f1, and now we can go rook b8, putting some pressure against white's pawn on b2, and there is already a hidden threat of playing bishop c3. So for instance, after h4, bishop c3 is a very strong move, attacking the b2 and e5 pawns. And of course, the idea is after b takes c3 to take back and win the rook on a1. So knight d5, knight takes d5 is not a very ambitious choice for white. we return to our main line, knight e4, queen c7, f4, and queen b6. And here, besides c4, white can also go bishop d3. It's white's second most popular move. And it's leading to a bit less force play, as it is not very direct. And now we have time to exchange our light squared bishop by playing bishop a6. Now after bishop takes a6, queen takes a6, white of course would like to castle kingside and therefore plays queen e2 here. And after the exchange of queens, king takes e2. Here we should play f5 because the knight on e4 is very well placed, and it takes a lot of control over the important d6 and c5 squares. And if we allow white, for instance, to play c4 followed by bishop e3, it's very hard to free ourselves from the grip. And therefore it's a good moment to go f5 here. And now the best way to continue for white is knight f2, with the idea to bring the knight to d3 later, where once again it can take control over the c5 square. Here there are a number of moves which are playable for black. The one I like best is c5. Now we would like to play c4, taking control over the d3 square, and white should prevent us from doing so by going c4 themselves. Knight b4. And here once again we discourage white from playing knight d3 because we would simply exchange it. After bishop d2, we play a5. The point being that if white takes on b4, we want to take back with the a pawn. Because if we would take with the c pawn here, white has the idea to play knight d3 followed by c5 and maybe later a3, and white can put a lot of pressure on our queen side. But instead, after a takes b4, we have a very solid position, which is it's equal here, and all our pawns are protected, and it's very hard for white to create any winning chances. So that is the most important variations after knight takes c6, and now we will look at white's other options on move 6, which are less frequently played but also quite interesting and at times challenging. The first one we look at is bishop e2, which is a very classical setup. White simply wants to castle kingside and might later play a setup like bishop e3 and slowly prepare an attack on the king side by playing f4, queen e1, queen g3, and so on. And we know this kind of setups from some other Sicilian variations like the Taimanov or the Najdorf. Here the situation is a bit more specific because we have the move bishop b4, attacking white's knight on c3 and thus threatening to win a pawn on e4. And now if white protects the pawn on e4, we would simply get good play. There is no good protecting move here. So white's idea here is usually to simply ignore the threat and still play castle. And here we should take the pawn, bishop takes c3, b takes c3, and knight takes e4. And we have a very sharp position where in return for the pawn, white has a strong initiative. White's main idea here is to play bishop a3 at some point in order to prevent us from castling kingside, after which of course our king on e8 would be in danger. So it's quite sharp, but also it has been known for a long time, and also it's there have been good ways. There have been found good ways for black to defend this position. We will look at the two main moves here, which are queen d3 and bishop d3. First, after queen d3, of course, our knight on e4 is attacked. We play d5, and now white plays bishop a3, preventing us from castling kingside. And there are various versions of this bishop a3 idea in the variation with bishop e2, after which we have different setups to defend ourselves. So it's quite important to study the differences between those positions and understand in which position black, how to react in which position. So here the best move, or maybe not the best move, the move I like best, let's say, is knight e7. It's also possible to go queen a5 here, which is I believe the main line, but I like knight e7 better because now white cannot prevent us from castling, after which our king will be in safety. And black is doing fine here. White also is not worse. White can, for instance, win back the pawn by playing c4, take on d5, and yet another time c4 after we take back with our e-pawn. And white has enough pressure to win back the pawn, but it only leads to an equal position. Once again, if you want to know more, you can study the chapter on the pawn sacrifice variation. Instead, white can also play bishop d3, once again attacking our knight on e4, and sacrificing another pawn on c3, but here taking it would be very dangerous. White would take on c6 and next bring the queen to g4 or h5, and our king is in a lot of danger here. So instead of taking on c3, we once again play d5. And here as well, white plays for the bishop a3 idea. Here we will only look at the immediate bishop a3, but just keep in mind there are some other versions. For instance, white might take on c6 first, or take on e4 first, and then go bishop a3. So you should study those as well. Here we only look at bishop a3, and here the best way to continue for black is queen a5. Attacking white's bishop on a3. And of course white wants to keep it on the diagonal in order to prevent us from castling. So here white should protect it by playing queen c1. Queen c1, and set knight b5 is not very effective because we can go a6. So white's most ambitious move is queen c1, but the queen is less well placed on c1 than on d1, because from d1 it could very quickly enter an attack on the king side via g4 or h5. Now on c1, it's not so easy to come to the king side. And here finally we will take pawn on c3. Not so much in order to win a pawn, but more importantly, we attack white's knight on d4, which now has to retreat to b3, where it's not very well placed. Yeah, because after a knight takes c6, b takes c6, we next would play c5, and then black would be ready to castle. So knight b3, queen c7, and we have a very complex position where here we usually do not manage to castle kingside, but there are other ideas for black. One is to castle queenside, but the even more fragment idea is to put the king to f7. That's also quite safe. So we can play f6 and king f7, and it's not so easy for white to attack our king on f7 because white's queen on c1 cannot come to the king side quickly. So white might have enough compensation for the 2 pawns, and actually we should always be ready to give back at least one of the pawns. But white is not better here, and black has certainly also quite good winning chances. So those are the 2 most important variations in the variation with 6 bishop e2. Next we look at a slower approach and the move g3. Here white wants to develop the bishop to g2, where it's quite well placed. It protects the pawn on e4, and it also takes some control over the d5 square, and sometimes it will also put a lot of pressure against our queen side. So quite a sensible approach, but on the other hand it's not very fast. White takes 2 moves to develop the bishop rather than 1, as we have seen earlier with bishop e2. And here we are able to quickly challenge white's center by playing d5. E takes d5. E takes d5, so black accepts an isolated queen's pawn on d5, which might later become weak, but we will have enough activity here in return. Bishop g2. And in general, if white now would manage to castle kingside and finish development, white would be a bit better, because our pawn on d5 is a long-term weakness. But after the very energetic move bishop g4, it's not so easy for white. And we will study in the theory chapter all sensible responses for white. For instance, f3 is a possibility, but it has the disadvantage of, first of all, weakening white's position, white's dark squares, but also the bishop on g2 now is a passive piece. White might play knight d2, also a playable move, but it does not put a lot of pressure on our position, and we will continue by going bishop b4 and take on c3 next. And finally, the move we will look at here is queen d3. White tries to avoid weakening your own position, but after bishop c5, once again, we put immediate pressure against white's position, and white has to make some concession. So for instance, bishop e3 is possible, protecting the knight on d4 and threatening to take on c6 and on c5. But we go queen b6, once again attacking the knight on d4, and here white cannot keep the knight on d4 and has to exchange. And after knight takes c6, we first take on e3, queen takes e3, queen takes e3, check, f takes e3, and b takes c6. And here we see black has improved the pawn structure. Now we no longer have an isolated queen's pawn, whereas white has an isolated pawn on e3. Still, it's an equal position. White, for instance, might play e4 at some point, but black has no problems here. Next, we will look at another slower move for white, which is a3. It is becoming quite popular recently because white avoids the very forcing main lines. The play is a bit slower here, and in general white gets a game here without having to remember a lot of theory. The point of a3 is to prevent bishop b4. We have seen this idea before. After bishop e2, black would play bishop b4. So here white first wants to prevent bishop b4 and then play bishop e2 and go for this classical setup. The disadvantage of a3, of course, is that it's not a very useful move for white in general. And my approach here is to develop the pieces in a way where a3 turns out to be a waste of time for white. First of all, we go d6. It's also possible to start by playing bishop e7, and it's even more popular. But the disadvantage of bishop e7 is that it allows knight takes c6 followed by e5, where play gets quite sharp. And I believe we can simply avoid it by starting with d6 here. White goes bishop e2, bishop e7. Now, for instance, castles. The move order does not matter so much here. White might also start by playing bishop e3. Castles, and now bishop e3. So this is the classical setup for white, and the one I mentioned earlier already when looking at the variation with 6 bishop e2. So white wants to continue by slowly improving the pieces, bringing them over to the king side, and starting to play for an attack. Here we play queen c7, which is generally a good place for our queen. We might later go knight e5 followed by knight c4, and it also supports the idea to play e5. White continues to play on the king side, f4, and here the usual way for black to respond is to play for to get counterplay on the queen side by going a6, b5, maybe b4 later. But I do not like it so much here because once we play b5, the move a3 becomes useful for white. And even a necessary move. So playing a6 here is possible, and that it would very likely directly transpose to a variation from the Taimanov Sicilian. But instead we can try to make the move a3 less useful by playing in the center rather than on the queen side. So here the move I like best is knight takes d4. if white takes with the queen, we can develop our queen side by going b6 and bishop b7. And if white takes with the bishop, we go e5. And now you can see that we can bring our bishop to e6 later. So first of all, after bishop e3 here, it's most precise to play a6 to prevent white from playing knight b5 at some point. For example, king h1. Now we take on f4. And after bishop takes f4, bishop e6, we manage to finish development and get an equal position. We will bring our rook to c8. The other rook might go to f8 or to d8, depending on circumstances. And we can also improve our minor pieces by going knight d7. We have a very nice outpost square on e5 for the knight. And after having played knight e5, we can also bring our bishop to f6, where it is a bit more actively placed. Here, the last variation which we look at for white on move 6 is bishop e3. It's a move very popular for players who do not know theory. It's a move very often encountered in various Sicilian variations. Usually the idea is connected with castling queenside by playing later queen d2, f3 and castling queenside. But here against the 4 knights, it is not white's best idea. Because now we can go bishop b4 and create a lot of pressure against white's center. And here already white should abandon the idea to play aggressively and to castle queenside. We will of course study it. Now what happens if white still does so, but generally we would go d5 and quickly attack white's center. So instead, it's more sensible to play bishop d3, after which we once again play d5, creating pressure against the pawn on e4. And if white takes on d5, after knight takes d5, we see a disadvantage of the move bishop e3. White would have to move the bishop again, and of course black has no problems here. Instead, white might take on c6 here, b takes c6, and now play e5, attack our knight, which leads to quite forcing play. Here it's possible to play knight d7 to keep to get a very complex position, but I do not like the move queen g4 here, because now we have to play bishop f8 in order to protect the pawn on g7. Instead, we can play d4, forcing the issue. White has to take on f6, and here it's important to take on e3 and not on c3, because if we take on c3, white's bishops would be very active and white would be a bit better. So instead, d takes e3 is the right choice. F takes g7, e takes f2 check. Here it's best for white not to take the pawn, because after king takes f2, queen d4 check. We next take on g7, and white's king will not be safe. So white's best move is king f1, rook g8, and once again white has only one good move here, which is queen g4, protecting the pawn on g7 and attacking our bishop on b4. Here we take on c3, b takes c3 and queen f6. So we will next win the pawn on g7, and once again, we reach an equal position, but quite a complex one. So both sides still have winning chances here. Finally, we will look at an alternative for white. Earlier, so far we have only analyzed the move knight c3, which indeed is white's most natural way of continuing, but also the move bishop d3 is playable. It also develops a piece, and white prepares to castle kingside. But it is a bit less challenging compared to knight c3, because here white does not yet threaten to play e5. And just to remind you, after e5 we have queen a5 check, and bishop d3 does not prevent this idea. Here once again we play knight c6, attacking white's knight on d4. Now knight takes c6 is white's best continuation, and here we yet again take with the b pawn. Here it's also possible to take with the d pawn, but it's easier for us to take with the b pawn, as we already have seen a very similar position before. Castles and d5, and here indeed if white goes knight c3, we would have transposed to a position we have already studied earlier. But instead of knight c3, white can also play knight d2 here. The knight is a bit better placed here. It cannot be so easily attacked, and also does not block the c pawn. So here white might play c4 later. Now we can go bishop d6. If you remember earlier, with the knight on c3, I recommended the move bishop e7, which here as well is very playable. But with the knight on d2, we can also play a bit more actively and put our bishop to d6, where it prevents white from playing e5, and also we might later play e5 ourselves. Now, for instance, queen e2. White is threatening to win a piece, so we play queen c7, attacking the pawn on h2. White goes h3, and we play castles, and once again in this pawn structure we get quite easy play. One idea here as well is to play a5 at a later moment, and if possible prepare to exchange our bishop by going bishop a6. White will usually bring their bishop to b2 by playing b3 and bishop b2, and after this it's quite useful to go e5 to block the bishop on b2. And of course we can bring our rook to e8 in order to keep the e5 pawn very safely protected. So those are the most important variations in the 4-Knight Sicilian, and thanks for watching this video. I hope to see you back in the theory chapters, where you can of course study the variations in quite some more detail.